He built it from nothing. Then he walked away. And while he was gone, the people he trusted turned it into something he no longer recognized. Welcome to a story about power, betrayal, and what happens when a founder decides to take everything back. Not with lawyers, not with press releases, but by walking through the front door like a stranger. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we tell stories that will keep you up at night. Drop your city or country in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The lobby of Nova Horizon Energy's headquarters looked exactly the way Adrian Holloway had always imagined it would, except for everything that mattered. The glass was still there. Floor-to-ceiling panels that caught the morning light and split it across the marble floors in long, pale ribbons. The logo was still mounted on the wall behind the reception desk. Those two words he'd written on a cocktail napkin 15 years ago after a third cup of coffee and a bad argument with his business partner about whether clean energy was a viable market or a pipe dream. Nova Horizon. He'd chosen the name because it meant something to him at the time. The idea that the horizon wasn't a fixed point, that it moved with you, that you never actually reached it, but the movement was the whole point. Someone had changed the font. It was a small thing, probably the kind of thing most people wouldn't notice walking through the front door. But Adrian noticed it immediately, the way you notice when someone's moved something in your house and put it back almost exactly where it was. The original logo had used a slightly rough sans serif, something that felt handmade, imperfect. The new version was cleaner, more corporate. The letters sat perfectly spaced, perfectly weighted, and it looked like every other energy company's logo Adrian had ever seen at a conference. He stood just inside the entrance for a moment, holding a manila folder against his chest. He was wearing a gray button-down shirt he'd bought at a department store 2 days earlier. Not his usual style, but not wrong for what he needed. He hadn't shaved in 4 days, which gave him the look of a man who was either going through something or had simply stopped caring about appearances, and he decided that was fine. He wasn't here to be recognized. He was here to watch. The reception desk was staffed by 2 people, a young woman with a headset who was typing and not looking up, and a man in his 30s who was leaning against the counter talking on a cell phone. Adrian approached the desk and waited. The woman kept typing. The man on the phone turned slightly away, like Adrian's presence was a mild inconvenience he was choosing to ignore. After about 45 seconds, the woman looked up. "Can I help you?" "I have an interview," Adrian said. 9:30, with human resources. She looked at her screen. Her expression didn't change. "Name?" "Daniel Holt." That was the name on the application. He'd used a variant of his middle name and his mother's maiden name, which felt both ridiculous and necessary. He'd submitted the application through the company's online portal 3 weeks ago, applying for a mid-level position in the operations planning division, a role that would put him in close proximity to the people running the company's strategic decisions without being senior enough to attract immediate attention. The interview request had come back within a week, which surprised him slightly. He'd expected more friction. The woman found something on her screen, printed a visitor badge, and slid it across the desk without making eye contact again. 11th floor. HR is on your left when you get off the elevator." "Thank you." The man on the phone glanced at Adrian as he walked toward the elevator bank. Adrian didn't look back. He'd been away for 4 years. That was the part people didn't quite understand when he tried to explain it, and he'd mostly stopped trying to explain it. The decision to step back from Nova Horizon hadn't been impulsive. It had been the result of a slow accumulation of things. Exhaustion he couldn't shake, a health scare that turned out to be less serious than he'd feared but frightening enough to make him stop and actually think, and a relationship that had quietly dissolved under the pressure of everything he'd been building and hadn't been paying attention to. He'd handed operational control to the board, retained his shares, and left. He told himself it was temporary. He'd spent the first year traveling, which felt meaningful for about 6 months, and then started to feel like avoidance. He'd spent the next 2 years working on a small consulting project in a different sector, which gave him something to do with his hands. And then, gradually, things had started reaching him. Rumors, fragments of conversation, an email from someone he trusted who still worked inside the company and was choosing their words carefully in a way that told Adrian more than the words themselves did. He hadn't acted immediately. That was a mistake he recognized now. He'd waited too long, told himself he was gathering information, told himself he needed to be sure. What he'd actually been doing was hoping he was wrong. He wasn't wrong. The elevator opened on 11, and he stepped into a hallway that smelled like new carpet and recycled air. A sign on the wall directed him to the HR suite, and he walked toward it with the folder under his arm. The woman who met him in the waiting area introduced herself as Trish Albano, Senior HR Coordinator. She was probably mid-40s, professional in a tired way that suggested she'd been doing this job for a long time and had made peace with most of it. She led him into a small conference room with a table, 4 chairs, and a window that looked out onto the building across the street. "Water?" she asked. "I'm fine, thank you." She sat down across from him and opened a printed copy of his resume. He'd constructed the resume carefully, real work history, real skills, but filtered through the Daniel Holt identity with enough specificity to hold up under moderate scrutiny. He wasn't planning to actually take the job. He just needed to get inside the building, spend time on multiple floors, have access to the kind of conversations that happened in conference rooms and kitchenettes and hallways that people thought were private. "So," Trish said, scanning the page, "operations planning, you've been doing this at Meridian for how long?" "About 6 years?" "And what made you want to make a move now?" It was the standard question, the one they always asked, and he'd prepared a standard answer. Something about growth opportunity, about Nova Horizons' mission in clean energy being something he believed in. The kind of answer that was true enough to be convincing, but vague enough not to invite follow-up. Before he could deliver it, the conference room door opened. The man who walked in didn't knock. He didn't apologize for interrupting. He walked in like the room had been waiting for him, glanced at Adrian, and then looked at Trish with the particular expression of someone who had decided the conversation they were witnessing wasn't worth their full attention. "Trish, I need the Castellan group files before noon. Did Sanderson send them up?" "I'll check as soon as—" "Before noon, Trish." He looked at his watch. "It's 9:45. That's not a wide window." "I understand. I'm in the middle of—" "I can see that." He looked at Adrian again, briefly. "We're a little backed up today. You might be waiting a while." He said it without particular apology or warmth, the way you'd tell someone the elevator was slow. Then he was gone. Trish looked down at the resume. She had the careful expression of someone smoothing something over. "Sorry about that. That's Marcus Kane. He's our COO. He runs a very fast-paced operation." Adrian said nothing. He filed the name away, though he already knew it. Marcus Kane. He'd promoted Kane himself, years ago, when Kane had been a sharp young VP with genuinely good instincts and a way of cutting through complexity in strategy sessions that Adrian had found valuable. Whatever Kane had been then, the version that had just walked through the door was something else. The ease of it, the absence of consideration. That wasn't stress, Adrian thought. That was habit. The interview continued. Trish was professional and thorough, asking the right questions in the right order. Adrian answered them well enough. He wasn't trying to impress her. He was listening to the sounds coming through the walls. A raised voice down the hall, a burst of laughter from what sounded like a group of people, a door slamming. I was building a picture from the ambient noise of the place. At one point, while Trish was making a note, he looked out the window and thought about the version of this building he'd imagined when they'd first signed the lease. The team had been 12 people. They'd celebrated with terrible pizza and a case of beer someone had found on sale. He'd given a speech that he'd been told was embarrassing in the best way, too earnest, too specific about what he actually wanted the company to become. He'd meant every word of it. He wondered if any of those people were still here. The second interview was scheduled for that afternoon on the 14th floor, with a department head named Greg Paulson who ran a team in operations. Adrian spent the 2 hours in between walking around the building. He'd been given a visitor badge with enough access to reach the common areas in the cafeteria, and he used the time carefully. The cafeteria told him a lot. It always did. He'd learned years ago that you could read a company's culture more accurately from how people behaved in unstructured spaces than from any culture document or leadership statement, who sat together, whether people talked or stared at phones, whether the junior staff scattered when a senior person walked in or held their ground. He sat at a table near the window with a coffee he didn't want and watched. The cafeteria was maybe 60% full. The energy was muted in a way that struck him, not the productive quiet of people who were focused, but something more subdued than that. A group of younger employees at a table near the far wall were talking in low voices, occasionally glancing toward the entrance. An older man was eating alone and reading something on his tablet with the deliberate focus of someone trying to be invisible. A woman in her early 30s was standing at the coffee station, stirring her drink and looking at nothing in particular, and something in her posture, the particular set of her shoulders, read to Adrian as someone who was very tired and trying not to show it. Two men he didn't recognize came in together talking loudly enough that the room could hear them without trying. One of them said something about a restructuring timeline, and the other laughed and said they should let the bottom feeders sweat. And neither of them seemed to think about how that landed in a room where people were eating lunch. Nobody reacted visibly. That was the part that stayed with Adrian. Not the comment he'd heard worse in his life, but the absence of reaction, the practiced neutrality. The way the younger employees at the far table didn't look up, didn't make eye contact with each other, just continued their conversation without a pause. He recognized that. It was what people did when they decided that reacting wasn't safe. He finished the coffee and left the cup on the table. The interview with Greg Paulson lasted 40 minutes and felt longer. Paulson was the kind of manager who asked questions and then answered them himself, who said things like, "What we're really looking for here is someone who gets it, without specifying what it was. He had a framed photo on his desk that might have been his family, or might have been a stock image. It was positioned at an angle that made it hard to tell. He spent a significant portion of the interview talking about the department he ran without saying anything specific about what the department actually did. Midway through, someone knocked on the open door. The woman who leaned in was probably 35, with short dark hair and the brisk efficiency of someone who had places to be and was allocating exactly as much time to this as it deserved. She looked at Paulson, not at Adrian. "Greg, the quarterly projection revisions, Victor pushed the submission deadline to Friday. Just wanted to make sure you knew." Paulson's expression shifted slightly. "That's not what we agreed on in last week's—" "I know. Victor changed it. Friday." She looked at Adrian for the first time. "Interview?" "Yes," Paulson said. She nodded, seemed to file that away, and left. Paulson recovered quickly, straightening in his chair with the air of a man reassembling something. "That was Evelyn Brooks," he said. "She's the EVP of Strategic Operations. Very sharp. Very driven." He said both things in a way that suggested he found them mildly inconvenient. Adrian said, "She seems organized." "She is. Paulson glanced toward the door. "She's in a tough spot right now between you and me. A lot of pressure from the top. But she manages." He said it kindly, which Adrian noted. Kindness about someone from a peer was different from the way the men in the cafeteria had spoken. It was information of a different kind. After the interview ended and Paulson told him they'd be in touch, Adrian walked to the elevator and waited. The building around him was doing what buildings did in the late afternoon. Shifting into a slightly different register, people moving faster or slower depending on what they were carrying home with them. A woman passed him in the hallway, pulling a rolling bag and talking on her phone about a delayed shipment. A man in a very good suit walked by without looking at anything. The elevator arrived. Adrian stepped in. As the doors were closing, a hand came through and held them. Evelyn Brooks stepped in. She was holding a tablet and a coffee cup simultaneously, which required a particular kind of practiced balance. She glanced at him briefly, the absent glance of someone who registers another person's presence without attaching importance to it, and then looked at her tablet. They wrote in silence for 2 floors. Then she said, without looking up, "Operations planning?" Adrian looked at her. "That's what you interviewed for?" She was still reading whatever was on her tablet. "I saw you with Trish this morning." "That's right." "What's your background?" He gave her the short version of the Daniel Holt narrative. 6 years at Meridian, focus on resource allocation and workflow analysis. She was still looking at her tablet while he talked, which could have felt dismissive but didn't quite, because he had the sense she was actually listening. "Meridian runs on a pretty different model than we do," she said. "Their operations structure is centralized in a way ours isn't, or wasn't." She seemed to stop herself, the smallest pause. "The adjustment curve can be steep. I've adjusted before." She looked at him then. It was brief, a few seconds, but it was the first time since he'd arrived at Nova Horizon that someone had actually looked at him with any particular attention. "Good," she said. The elevator stopped. She stepped out without looking back. The doors closed. Adrian stood in the descending elevator with his folder against his chest and thought about what he'd seen. He'd come back expecting corruption, and he'd found it. He'd expected arrogance, and that was everywhere too. But what he hadn't quite expected, what sat with him as the lobby opened up and he walked back out into the afternoon light, was the grief of it. That was the right word, he thought. Not anger, not yet, grief. The feeling of standing in a place you loved and not recognizing it. He'd built this company on a specific premise, that the people who built something honest could hold on to it. He'd believed that long enough and hard enough that he'd stopped checking whether it was still true. Now he knew. And knowing changed everything. He walked to his car, got in, and sat for a moment without starting the engine. He opened the manila folder on the passenger seat and looked at the documents inside. Not the fake resume, but the other papers. The ones he'd been collecting for 6 months. Ownership records, financial filings, board meeting minutes. A charter clause he'd written himself 15 years ago that nobody had ever needed to use. He closed the folder. He'd come back quietly because he'd wanted to understand the full shape of what had happened before he moved. He understood it now. Not all of it. There were still pieces he needed, conversations he hadn't heard, documents he hadn't seen. But he understood enough. He started the car. Tomorrow, he'd come back. He came back the following Monday. Not as Daniel Holt. That name had served its purpose. Paulson had called on Thursday to say the position was moving forward, that they'd like him to come in for a third conversation with someone senior, and Adrian had thanked him and said he'd confirm by end of week. He hadn't confirmed. The interview process was a door he'd used to get inside, and he didn't need it anymore. What he needed now was different. He had a contact inside the building, had maintained one carefully for the better part of a year, a woman named Sandra Chu who had been with Nova Horizon since year 3, who ran a small team in regulatory compliance and who had sent him the first email 8 months ago that had used the phrase "something doesn't feel right" in a way that Adrian recognized as someone choosing understatement because they weren't sure who was reading. He'd called her from a number she wouldn't recognize. She'd picked up, anyway. That conversation had lasted 2 hours and left him sitting in a rental car in a parking garage trying to decide whether what he was feeling was rage or something quieter and more deliberate. He'd decided on deliberate. Rage was expensive and imprecise. Sandra had been feeding him what she could without exposing herself. Fragments of board communications, a restructuring proposal that had appeared without warning, financial summary documents that didn't align with the ones being shared externally. None of it was conclusive on its own. All of it pointed the same direction. He met her at a coffee shop 4 blocks from the building. She was already there when he arrived, sitting with her hands wrapped around a mug she probably hadn't been drinking from. She was in her early 50s, with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the specific kind of stillness that comes from spending a long time trying to be invisible in places where being noticed felt dangerous. "You look different," she said when he sat down. "Different how?" "I don't know. More tired, maybe. Or more awake." She studied him. "It's hard to tell with you." "I'm both," he said. She almost smiled. "I got more of what you asked for. The amended shareholder agreements from last fall. Someone in legal pulled them for a routine audit, and then the request got canceled 3 days later and the files got archived somewhere they shouldn't have been." She slid a thumb drive across the table casually, like she was passing the sugar. "I don't know what's on it exactly. I didn't look too hard." He picked it up. "How are you doing, Sandra?" "Actually." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." She looked out the window at the street. "It's strange," she said. "You work somewhere long enough, you stop noticing when things shift. It's gradual, right? One thing changes and you adjust, and then another thing changes and you adjust again. And at some point you look up and you're somewhere completely different from where you started, but you can't quite identify the moment it happened." She looked back at him. "I keep thinking about the early days. When Reyes was still running the research division, and we used to have those Friday afternoon meetings that ran 3 hours because everyone actually wanted to talk about the work." "Reyes left?" "Year before last. There were about 6 of them who left inside of 6 months. All quiet. No announcements, no farewell emails. One day they were there, next day they weren't." She picked up her mug. "The people who replace them are competent, technically competent, but it's different." Adrian knew what she meant. He didn't say so. He asked her instead about the Castellan group, the name Kane had mentioned in the hallway outside Trish's office. And he watched her expression change in a way that told him the name meant something to her. "Where did you hear that?" she asked. Inside the building. She set the mug down. Castellan is a private equity group. They acquire energy companies, restructure them, and resell the operating assets. They don't build anything. They buy things that were built and strip them down to what turns a return. She said it without drama, like she was reading from a report. There have been conversations, nothing official, but the kind of conversations that happen when someone has already decided and they're just managing the timeline. Adrian looked at the thumb drive in his hand. How long has this been going on? The Castellan conversations? Probably 18 months, maybe longer before anyone knew to notice. She paused. Victor Sloan came back from a trip to New York last spring, and the whole energy of the floor changed. Not obviously, but the way he was walking, the way he was talking to Kane, like they'd agreed on something. Victor Sloan, the company's current CEO, who had been appointed by the board during the transitional period after Adrian stepped back. Adrian had not chosen Sloan himself. The board had moved quickly, which he hadn't objected to at the time because he'd trusted the board. That trust was one of several things he'd have to account for when this was over. I need 2 more weeks inside this building, Adrian said. Maybe 3. Sandra was quiet. I won't put you in anything direct, he said. No meetings, no documents with your name on them. I just need to be able to move around without someone calling security. You realize, she said carefully, that if this goes the way you're describing and they figure out that it won't come from me. That's not the same as it won't come out. He looked at her steadily. No, it's not. He didn't offer her a prettier version of that. She'd earned the honest one. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, I'll get you a contractor credential. We've had external consultants cycling in and out for months. One more won't stand out. Thank you, Sandra. She picked up her mug again. Don't thank me yet. The contractor credential got him back into the building as an external strategy consultant, which was a category of person that apparently had near total access and no clear accountability to any single department. A situation that told Adrian something in itself about how loosely the company was now being managed. He spent the first week moving carefully, establishing a pattern of presence that felt routine. He sat in on 2 open meetings. He used the 14th floor conference rooms that external consultants were permitted to book. He ate lunch in the cafeteria and said very little to anyone. And he listened. The picture that assembled itself across those days was worse than what Sandra had described, not because the individual pieces were more dramatic, but because of the texture of it, the density of small accommodations and willful ignorances that had compacted over time into something structural. He heard, through a wall in the conference area, a conversation between 2 people he didn't recognize about a research program that had been defunded. The program had been working on grid storage technology, the kind of work that was core to the company's original mission, the reason several of the early engineers had joined instead of taking better-paid positions elsewhere. It had been defunded quietly, funding redirected to operational efficiency initiatives that turned out, on closer examination, to mean consulting fees for a firm that had connections to Sloan's previous employer. He found the document that confirmed this, not through Sandra, but through a presentation deck that someone had left open on a shared drive that the contractor credential had read access to. It was titled Resource Reallocation Summary, Q3, and it was 63 pages of language designed to make what it described feel inevitable and measured. Adrian read it in a borrowed conference room over the course of an afternoon, making notes in a small notebook he kept in his jacket pocket. On the 8th day, he saw Victor Sloan in person for the first time. Sloan was taller than Adrian had pictured from photographs, and he moved through the 14th floor corridor with the specific ease of someone who had decided, at some point, that the space they occupied was theirs by nature rather than circumstance. He was with 2 people Adrian didn't recognize, speaking in a low voice, and as they passed the alcove where Adrian was standing with a coffee and his notebook, Sloan glanced over without slowing. The look lasted maybe 2 seconds. Sloan's expression didn't shift. He looked at Adrian the way you look at furniture, acknowledged in the peripheral sense, not registered as significant. He kept walking. Adrian watched him go. He'd promoted Kane himself years ago, but Sloan was different. Sloan had been an external appointment, which meant the corruption inside Nova Horizon wasn't entirely an internal rot. Someone had placed Sloan here, and Sloan had found Kane, or Kane had found Sloan, And between the two of them, they'd built something that used the company's name and its resources and its reputation as a vehicle for something that had nothing to do with what the company was supposed to be. That evening, in the apartment he'd rented for the month under a name connected to his consulting identity, he opened the thumb drive Sandra had given him and spent 4 hours reading. The amended shareholder agreements were the key. He'd suspected it from Sandra's description, but reading the documents themselves was different from suspecting them. Someone, and the language was careful enough that it took him most of the first hour to identify who had drafted amendments to the original shareholder agreements that diluted the weight of the founding shareholder clause. The clause he was thinking of was one he'd written himself, on the advice of a lawyer he trusted, and with the specific intention of protecting against exactly this kind of scenario. It stipulated that the founding majority shareholder retained override authority in the event of any material transaction, acquisition, merger, or asset sale, that the shareholder hadn't approved. The amendments didn't eliminate the clause. They couldn't. It was written into the company charter, not just the shareholder agreement, and changing it required a supermajority vote that would have been noticed. Instead, they introduced language that redefined material transaction in ways that were narrow enough to potentially exclude the kind of deal being structured with Castellan. It was sophisticated legal work, the kind that was designed to hold up under moderate scrutiny and fall apart under intensive examination. But by the time intensive examination arrived, the transaction would already have closed. Adrian sat with that for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called a number he hadn't used in 2 years. The man who answered was named Robert Fitch, and he was a corporate attorney with a practice that specialized in shareholder rights litigation. Adrian had known him for 15 years and trusted him in the specific way you trust people who have never once told you what you wanted to hear. "I need to talk," Adrian said. "You need to talk or you need legal advice?" "Both." A pause. "You sound like you haven't slept." "I slept fine." "You sound like you're lying about having slept fine." Fitch was quiet for a moment. "Is this about Nova Horizon?" "Yes." Another pause, longer this time. "I'll clear my Thursday afternoon. Come to the office." The meeting with Fitch lasted 3 hours, and it was not comfortable. Fitch had the lawyer's particular gift for identifying the weakest point in any argument and pressing on it with a kind of calm persistence that felt more exposing than anger would have. He went through Adrian's documents methodically, asked questions that Adrian sometimes couldn't answer, and twice stopped and looked at him with an expression that said he was weighing something. "The charter clause," Fitch said, near the end. "You're right that it wasn't eliminated, but the amendment language muddies it, depending on how the transaction is structured, and if they're smart, they'll structure it to fall into the gap. You'd be looking at a contested interpretation, not a clear override." "How long would that take to resolve?" "In litigation? 18 months minimum, maybe longer." "The deal closes in..." Adrian checked his notes. "Based on the timeline I've pieced together, they're targeting a board vote within 60 days, probably sooner." Fitch put down his pen. "Then you can't win this in court before it happens." "I know." "So what are you actually planning?" Adrian looked at him. "The charter clause requires a majority shareholder who's physically present to invoke it. It can't be done by proxy." Fitch was very still for a moment. "You're going to walk into the boardroom?" "Yes." "Adrian." Fitch picked his pen up again, turned it in his fingers. "If you walk into that boardroom and your evidence isn't airtight, if there's a single document you can't verify, a single number that doesn't hold, they'll find a way to make you the story. They'll say you came back erratically, that you're destabilizing a company in the middle of a legitimate strategic process. They'll call it a hostile intervention by a founder who walked away voluntarily." "I know that too." "So what's missing?" Fitch asked. "From what you have, what are you still looking for?" Adrian thought about it carefully. "The profit-sharing arrangement. Sandra found references to it in internal communications. The implication that Sloan and Kane have a financial arrangement with Castellan that's personal, not disclosed to the board. If they're taking personal payments tied to the deal closing, that's not just bad governance, that's fraud. And you don't have that documented." "Not yet." Fitch tapped the pen against his legal pad. "Find it. Don't walk into that room until you have it. If you're going to do this, do it in a way that they can't recover from." The document that broke it open came from a direction Adrian hadn't anticipated. He'd been in the building 12 days by then, and the contractor credential had given him enough routine presence that people had stopped processing him as new. He had access to the 14th floor common areas and most of the conference rooms, and he'd developed the habit of arriving early, before most of the senior staff, and staying late, working in whichever space was empty. It was on a Tuesday evening, past 6 o'clock, when the building had emptied into that particular late-day quiet where the HVAC system became audible and the carpet absorbed the sound of footsteps differently. He was in a small conference room on 14 with his laptop and his notes, when he heard voices in the corridor. He recognized Kane's voice first, and then a voice he didn't recognize. Lower, more deliberate, with the careful cadence of someone who was used to being listened to without raising their volume. He didn't move. The conference room had a glass panel beside the door, and he kept his head down over the laptop. "The timeline holds," the unfamiliar voice said. They were close enough that he could hear without trying. 62 days to board vote. Castellan's legal team has the structure finalized. "Sloane's nervous about the clause," Kane said. "The founding shareholder provision. It's handled." The amendment language was reviewed by 2 separate outside firms. Even if someone challenged it, the transaction closes before any injunction could be granted. "What about Brooks?" A brief pause. "She'll sign off. She doesn't know what she's signing off on." Kane said something Adrian couldn't hear completely. A name or a number. The other voice said, "That gets transferred after close. Standard arrangement. It doesn't appear anywhere in the disclosed terms." They moved down the corridor, and the voices faded. Adrian sat very still, listening to the HVAC. Standard arrangement. The phrase sat in the air of the small room. It was the language of something that had been done before. Not improvised, not panicked, but practiced. The phrase meant there was documentation somewhere, because people who did this kind of thing always documented it, always created a record they could use against each other if the arrangement went wrong. He needed to find it, and he needed to find it without tipping anyone off that he was looking. He closed his laptop and sat in the quiet conference room for another 20 minutes, working through what he knew and what he still needed. The shape of the conspiracy was clear now. Sloane and Kane had arranged a sale to Castellan at a value they'd negotiated to be artificially low. The company's assets and mission would be dismantled in the restructuring that followed. And somewhere in the terms was a provision that delivered personal financial benefit to the 2 men for making it happen. Evelyn Brooks, the EVP who'd come to Paulson's office to announce the changed deadline, who'd looked at Adrian in the elevator with the focused attention of someone who was carrying a lot and knew it. She'd been positioned as the internal validator, the one whose approval gave the process legitimacy, without being told what she was actually approving. That part bothered him in a particular way that was different from the rest. The corruption of Sloane and Kane was comprehensible. Adrian had seen that kind before, the kind that came from proximity to large numbers, and the gradual erosion of the line between the company's interests and your own. He didn't forgive it, but he understood its mechanics. Evelyn Brooks was something else. She was being used, and she didn't know it, and the people using her had chosen her specifically because her reputation for rigor made her useful cover. They had handed her documents with strategic omissions and let her believe she was making an informed decision. Adrian thought about her in the elevator, the balance of the tablet and the coffee cup, the way she'd said, "The adjustment curve can be steep." Not unkindly, more like a warning she was offering to someone she'd never see again, which in that moment she'd believed was true. She was going to have to find out what she'd been part of. He wasn't looking forward to what that would cost her. He gathered his things, nodded to the security guard at the lobby desk who had started recognizing him by sight, and gave a small nod back, and walked out into the evening air. There was a moment crossing the plaza toward the parking structure when the full weight of it settled on him. Not anxiety exactly, but a kind of reckoning. He'd made choices that led here. He'd handed this company to a board he trusted without staying close enough to see what the trust was worth. He'd left when he was exhausted and told himself it was mature and generous, but the leaving had also been a choice not to fight for something he'd built and cared about, and that choice had costs he was only now adding up. The board had people on it he still believed in. 3 members, he thought, maybe 4. People who were outvoted, or who were working with the same incomplete information as Brooks, or who simply hadn't known what to look for. He'd need to reach them before he walked into that room. He crossed the street and didn't look back at the building. He was close. He knew it with a certainty that wasn't quite confidence, more like the feeling of something inevitable approaching, the moment in a long and difficult process where the outcome has already been determined and what remained was the work of getting there without breaking anything you needed intact. He'd spent 4 years thinking he could afford to wait. He had 62 days. The document he needed was sitting inside a system he technically had no right to access. He knew this. He also knew that in 23 days, the timeline he'd reconstructed from the corridor conversation and 3 subsequent weeks of careful observation, the board would convene for what was being described internally as a strategic direction review, which was the kind of language designed to sound procedural and mean something else entirely. The vote to approve the Castellan transaction would happen at that meeting. After that, the legal machinery would move faster than any challenge he could mount through legitimate channels, and Fitch had been clear enough about what that meant. So he needed the document, and he needed someone who could get it without being the one who got it. He thought about this for 2 days before he admitted to himself who he was going to ask. Her name was Paul Deering, and he hadn't spoken to her in 3 years. She was a forensic accountant who had worked with Nova Horizon during its early growth phase, helping structure the company's financial reporting before they were large enough to have a full internal audit team. She was meticulous, private, and had a professional reputation that she guarded carefully, which was why asking her this was going to be a complicated conversation. He called her on a Wednesday morning from the apartment. She answered on the 4th ring. "Adrian Holloway," she said. Not a greeting, more like reading something off a label. "Paula, I saw your name and I thought about not picking up. But you did." Morbid curiosity. She wasn't joking exactly, but she wasn't entirely serious either. That was always how Paula operated. A layer of dry distance that covered something more engaged underneath. "What do you need?" "A conversation first." "How long is this conversation going to be?" "As long as it needs to be." She sighed, a short, controlled exhale. "Come to my office. Tomorrow. 11. He told her everything. Not the emotional shape of it. Paula didn't operate in that register and would have been made uncomfortable by it. But the structural facts, laid out in the sequence he'd assembled them. The contractor credential, the corridor conversation, the amended shareholder agreements, the references to a personal financial arrangement that existed outside the disclosed transaction terms, the 62-day timeline now down to 39. Paula listened without interrupting. She was sitting behind her desk with her hands flat on the surface, which was her version of giving something her complete attention. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "What kind of document are you looking for?" she asked. "Something that shows the personal arrangement. A payment schedule, a side agreement, a wire transfer record. Anything that establishes that Sloan and Kane are receiving personal benefit from Castellan that isn't disclosed to the board. And you believe this document exists inside Nova Horizon's financial systems. Or Castellan's, but I don't have a way into Castellan's systems." Paula looked at the window. "You're asking me to pull financial records from a system I don't have authorized access to." "I'm asking if you know someone who can." She turned back to him. "That's a fine distinction." "I know. It's also the kind of thing that, if it came out wrong, would end my practice." He didn't tell her it wouldn't. He'd promised Sandra honest stakes, and he'd do the same here. "Yes." She looked at him for a long time. He'd known Paula Deering for 18 years, had watched her build a practice from a 2-person office above a dry cleaner into something with 20 staff and a waiting list for new clients, and he knew that the thing she was turning over in her mind wasn't fear. She'd never been particularly afraid of difficult situations. What she was turning over was the question of whether the outcome justified the exposure. "Tell me about the charter clause," she said finally. He explained it. She asked 3 questions, each one more specific than the last, and he answered them carefully. When he finished, she picked up a pen and turned it in her fingers, a habit he'd forgotten she had that reminded him briefly and uncomfortably of Fitch doing the same thing. "If you invoke the clause and the fraud evidence is solid," she said, "the board has to act. They don't have discretion." "Not under the charter, no." "And if the fraud evidence is incomplete?" "Then they have discretion, and Sloan controls enough of the room to use it." Paula set the pen down. "Give me a week," she said. "I have 39 days. "Then a week is fine." She looked at him with the expression she always used when she thought he was about to say something unnecessary. "Don't thank me." He didn't. Paula called him on day 6. He was in the coffee shop across from the Nova Horizon building, which had become a kind of base of operations, close enough to walk over if he needed to, public enough that nobody paid attention to him. He'd developed a routine there, a corner table by the window, the same coffee he didn't taste. 3 hours of work in the morning, followed by a walk around the block that he told himself was for air and was actually for thinking. "I found it," Paula said. He kept his voice level. "Tell me." "It's a consulting agreement, structured to look like a professional services contract between a shell company called Meridian Advisory Partners and Castellan Group subsidiaries. Meridian Advisory Partners was registered in Delaware 14 months ago. The registered agent is a law firm with connections to Kane's brother-in-law." She paused. "Sloan is the beneficial owner. Kane is listed as a silent partner. The agreement specifies payment tied to the successful completion of an acquisition transaction involving Nova Horizon Energy, with the total compensation reaching 8 figures if the deal closes within the specified window." 8 figures. Adrian was quiet for a moment. "How did you get this?" he asked. "You told me not to ask how you found things," Paula said. "Extend me the same courtesy." "Fair. Adrian." She said his name in a particular way that meant she was about to tell him something he needed to sit still for. "The agreement has a clause. If the transaction is blocked or materially delayed by any party with a disclosed connection to Nova Horizon's founding structure, the payment schedule accelerates, and Castellan has the right to initiate litigation against Nova Horizon directly. It's designed as a poison pill. If you stop this deal as Adrian Holloway, founder and majority shareholder, it triggers a separate financial liability for the company." He absorbed that. "How large?" "Potentially 40 to 60 million in claimed damages. Castellan's legal team would argue material interference with a disclosed transaction process." "The transaction was never disclosed to the full board." "No, but the clause doesn't require that. It requires only that a transaction process was underway, which is documented in the preliminary term sheet that the board's executive committee signed off on. 3 members. Sloan, Kane, and 1 independent director." "Which independent director?" "Patrick Hollis." Adrian closed his eyes for a second. He'd known Hollis. Not well. Hollis had joined the board after Adrian's departure, but he'd reviewed his background at the time and hadn't found anything concerning, which meant either Hollis had been corrupted over time or Hollis didn't understand what he'd signed, or both. "Send me everything you have," he said. "It'll be in your secure inbox within the hour. And Adrian, I know." "No, I don't think you do." Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. "What they've built is designed to survive a challenge. It's not sloppy. Someone who knows corporate law very well put this together with the specific intention of making it expensive and painful to undo. Even with everything I've sent you, this fight is going to leave marks." "I know that, Paula." "You sound like you know it abstractly. I want to make sure you know it concretely. The company takes a hit even if you win." "I know," he said, for the 3rd time. A pause. "Okay," she said, and hung up. He sat with his coffee and looked at the building across the street.
That's why.
He called Fitch that afternoon and they spent 90 minutes on the phone going through Paula's documents. Fitch asked questions in the same relentless way he always did, stopping twice to say he needed 5 minutes, which meant he'd found something that required him to recalibrate. "The poison pill is real," Fitch said eventually, "but it's not as clean as they think. The clause specifies interference by a party with a disclosed connection. You haven't disclosed yourself yet. Legally, until you invoke the charter clause, you're operating under a contractor identity that has no formal connection to the founding structure. So if I invoke the clause in the boardroom, before they know I'm there, the interference provision can be argued to apply prospectively, not retrospectively, meaning the poison pill activates from the moment of disclosure, not before. The documents you've gathered prior to that moment were gathered by Daniel Holt and a third-party forensic accountant acting independently." Fitch stopped. "It's not airtight. They'll argue it, but it gives you ground to stand on." "Good enough to take into the boardroom? Combined with the fraud evidence?" "Yes, I think so." A pause. "I'd feel better with one more thing. The falsified financial reports. Sandra mentioned them early on and you've got the internal summary documents, but do you have the external filings that contradict them? The ones submitted to the board's audit committee? He did. He'd had them for 2 weeks, pulled from the public financial disclosure database and cross-referenced against the internal documents. The gap between what was being reported externally and what the internal documents showed wasn't massive, but it was consistent and directional, and it was the kind of thing that an audit committee member who wasn't reading carefully or who was being managed would miss. "I have them," Adrian said. "Then you're ready." Fitch was quiet for a moment. "When's the board meeting?" 19 days. "I'll file the preliminary shareholder notification Friday. It's a formality, but it puts your majority shareholder status on record before the meeting. That closes the window on any argument that your claim was sprung without notice." "They'll see it." "Yes, they'll see it." Fitch's tone was measured, deliberate. "That's the point. They need to know you're coming, not because you owe them courtesy, but because walking into that room as a surprise is a move that Sloan's attorneys will use to paint you as acting in bad faith. Walking in after proper notification is exercising a documented right." Adrian thought about that. He understood the logic. He also understood that the moment the filing went in, Sloan and Kane would know. They'd have 19 days to prepare, to find arguments, to construct whatever narrative gave them the best chance of controlling the room. "What will they do when they see it?" he asked. "They'll try to accelerate the board vote, move it up before the 19 days are out." Fitch's voice stayed even. "Which is why we're going to file an emergency shareholder petition simultaneously that requires 48 hours notice for any material board action. It won't stop them forever, but it buys you the window." "And if they try to dispute my majority status?" "They can't. The shares are registered. The ownership record is clean." A pause. "Adrian, they're going to fight dirty when they see what's coming. I need you to be prepared for that. What does that look like?" "It looks like a press release about an erratic founder attempting to interfere with a value-creating strategic transaction. It looks like calls to board members framing you as destabilizing. It looks like legal motions filed Thursday afternoon before a holiday weekend." He stopped. "It looks like everything except engaging with your actual evidence, because they can engage with your actual evidence." "I know how this works," Adrian said. "I know you do. I'm saying it out loud so it doesn't catch you off guard when it happens. And you're standing in a hallway at 9 in the morning reading something about yourself that isn't true." The filing went in on Friday at 3:45. By 7 that evening, Adrian's phone had received 4 calls from numbers he didn't recognize, and 1 text from Sandra that said only, "They know." "Building is different tonight." He texted back that he understood, that she should stay out of anything that looked like a confrontation, and that she'd done more than he had any right to ask. She replied, "Just finish it." The press release came out Saturday morning. It was everything Fitch had predicted: language about protecting shareholder value, about a disruptive action by a former founder who had voluntarily stepped away from the company's operations and was now seeking to interfere with a legitimate strategic process at a critical juncture. It described Adrian's involvement in terms that were technically accurate and contextually misleading in every sentence. It called the Castellan transaction a transformative opportunity and referred to Adrian's shareholder petition as legally premature and strategically damaging. He read it once, put his phone face down on the kitchen table, and made himself eat breakfast. Then he read it again. There was a line near the end that stayed with him. "The board remains committed to a process that serves the interests of all stakeholders, including the communities Nova Horizon was founded to support." He thought about who had written that line and whether they'd felt anything writing it, and decided it didn't matter. Fitch called it 9. "They filed a motion Friday night," he said without preamble, "challenging the validity of the charter clause on the grounds that the company's transition to a publicly registered entity in 2019 materially altered the operative legal framework of the original charter provisions. Can that argument work? Not quickly. The transition documentation explicitly preserved the founding charter provisions. It's in the registration filing, but it's a delay tactic, and a good one. It'll take me the weekend to build a response." "How does this affect the board meeting timeline?" "The emergency petition holds. They can't move the vote up, but they may try to introduce procedural challenges at the meeting itself. Questions about your standing, about the validity of the invocation mechanism." He paused. "I'm going to be in that room with you. I want that on the table now." "I was planning on it." "Good." Another pause. "How are you doing?" It was a question Fitch almost never asked, which meant it was a question worth answering honestly. I keep thinking about the company, Adrian said. Not winning, just the company. What it was supposed to be. Fitch was quiet for a moment. That's either a good sign or a bad one. I haven't figured out which. When you do, call me. The board meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday. On the Monday before it, Adrian sat in the apartment and went through everything one more time. The documents were organized across the kitchen table in a sequence that matched the argument. The falsified financial reports first, then the internal summaries that contradicted them, then the Meridian Advisory Partners Shell Company registration, then the consulting agreement, then the amended shareholder provisions, with Fitch's annotated analysis of why the amendments didn't hold under the original charter, and finally the charter clause itself, which he'd printed in its original form, the version he'd personally signed with the company's first general counsel in a conference room that had been so cold they'd all kept their coats on. He looked at it for a while. He wasn't thinking about the meeting anymore. He was thinking about the day they drafted it, the argument he'd had with the general counsel about whether the founding shareholder clause was too aggressive, whether it created the wrong incentives, whether it suggested distrust of the governance structure they were building. He'd argued for keeping it anyway, not because he expected to use it, because he believed that good institutions needed mechanisms that assumed failure, needed provisions that acknowledged human nature without apologizing for it. He'd been right. He didn't feel good about being right. At 6 in the evening, his phone rang. The number on the screen wasn't one he recognized, and he almost didn't answer it. He answered on the third ring. "This is Adrian Holloway." A pause. "Mr. Holloway." The voice was careful, a woman's voice, measured in a way that sounded like someone choosing each word after consideration. "My name is Evelyn Brooks. I think you know who I am." He was very still. "I know who you are," he said. "I need to talk to you." Another pause. "Not on behalf of the company, personally." He looked at the document spread across the kitchen table. "How did you get this number?" he asked. "I've been looking for you since Friday." She said it without apology, the way she'd said things in the elevator, directly, without decorating it. "I saw the shareholder filing. I read the press release. And then I did something I probably should have done 6 months ago, which is go back and read the transaction documents very carefully." A pause that had a different texture to it, something with weight behind it. "I have been approving things I didn't understand. I thought I understood them. I was wrong." Adrian said nothing. "I'm not calling to ask you to protect me," Evelyn said. "I'm calling because there are things you probably don't have that I can give you. And because whatever happens in that room tomorrow, I don't want to be the person who stood on the wrong side of it because I was too proud to pick up the phone." Outside the apartment window, the city was doing its evening thing. Lights coming on, the distant sound of traffic, the particular quality of urban dusk that made everything look slightly cinematic and slightly exhausted. Adrian looked at it for a moment. "Where are you right now?" he asked. "Coffee shop on Meridian Avenue, about 6 blocks from the building." "Stay there," he said. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. She was at a table near the back when he walked in. She had a cup she wasn't drinking from and a tablet face down on the table, and she looked like someone who had spent the weekend running through a scenario in their head from every available angle and hadn't liked any of the conclusions. He sat down across from her. She looked at him. The same focused look from the elevator, but different now. There was something exposed in it. Not weakness exactly, more like the expression of someone who had recently discovered they'd been standing on ground they hadn't tested. "You're Adrian Holloway," she said. "Yes." "You came in as a contractor." "Before that, as a job applicant." Something crossed her face. "I interviewed you." "You looked at me in an elevator. It wasn't an interview." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "How long have you been building this?" 6 months of gathering, 4 weeks inside the building. She absorbed that. "And you know about the Meridian Advisory Partners Agreement?" "Yes." "They used me," she said. It wasn't a question. The flatness of her voice was the sound of someone who had already gone through the anger and arrived somewhere more contained. "The projections I approved in February. The restructuring framework I signed off on in April. The preliminary board memo in June." She looked at the face-down tablet. "I kept asking for the full transaction analysis, and they kept giving me summaries. I thought—" She stopped. "I thought I was being protective of the process. I thought I was adding rigor. I was adding their legitimacy to a document they'd already decided on. Adrian didn't tell her it wasn't her fault. That kind of comfort was both dishonest and useless at this stage. "What do you have?" he asked. She turned the tablet over, opened it, and slid it across the table. On the screen was an email chain. He read the first 3 exchanges and understood immediately what he was looking at. The chain was between Kane and a legal contact at Castellan, dated 11 months ago. It discussed the plan to route the transaction through Evelyn's approval process as a means of creating internal credibility for the board memo. The exact phrase Kane had used was "use Brooks as the stamp." Below that, another email from Sloane. "She won't look past what we give her. She's ambitious, not suspicious." Adrian looked up. Evelyn was watching him read. Her expression didn't change, but something around her eyes did. Just slightly, just briefly. "I found it Saturday night," she said. "I still had access to Kane's shared drive from a project we worked on together last year. He never revoked it. He was careless. He thought I was predictable." She said it evenly. He wasn't entirely wrong about that. Until he was. Adrian looked at the email chain again. It was what he'd needed. Not just the financial fraud, but the internal record of intent. The explicit use of Evelyn's credibility as a mechanism of concealment. Combined with Paula's documents and the falsified financials, it closed the circle. "Will you come tomorrow?" he asked. She looked at him. "To the board meeting?" "Yes." "In what capacity?" "As someone who was misled and can say so in the room, not to defend yourself, to correct the record." She picked up her cup, looked at it, set it back down. "If I do that, my career at Nova Horizon is over regardless of what happens." "Probably." "And if you win tomorrow, I'm the person who enabled the process that made the whole thing necessary." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "You're not great at convincing people to help you." "I've been told that." Something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. "What time does it start?" 9 o'clock. She closed the tablet. "I'll be there." He walked out of the coffee shop 20 minutes later with the email chain in his secure file and the particular feeling of a structure that had been assembling piece by piece, finally reaching its final form. Not relief. It was too early for relief, and there was too much that could still go wrong. But something solid. The feeling of standing on tested ground. 19 days had become 1. Tomorrow he would walk into a room he'd built, carrying evidence of what had been done to it, and he would not be alone in that room when he did. He crossed the street and didn't slow down. He didn't sleep well. That wasn't a surprise, and he didn't spend time being bothered by it. He lay in the dark for a few hours, his mind moving through the sequence of tomorrow. The way you rehearse something, not because you've forgotten it, but because the rehearsal is the only thing keeping the larger anxiety at arm's length. Documents. Order of presentation. Fitch on his left. The Charter Clause, page 4, paragraph 3. The language he'd written himself and knew by memory. Now the way you know a thing you've carried for a long time. He got up at 5:15 and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window watching the city do its early morning version of itself. The delivery trucks, the runners, the particular gray-blue quality of light before the sun got organized. He thought about the 12 people from the original team. He wondered how many of them knew what had happened to the thing they'd built together. He wondered if it mattered whether they knew. He decided it did. Not for him. But it did. At 6:30 he showered and dressed in a suit he hadn't worn in 4 years, which turned out to still fit in the way that things fit when you haven't changed as much as you sometimes think. He looked at himself in the mirror for a moment without particular feeling, then picked up his bag and his folder and left the apartment. But Fitch was waiting in the lobby of the building across from Nova Horizon at 8:15. He was in his good suit, carrying a leather briefcase that Adrian had seen him carry for 20 years, and his expression was the same one he wore in court. Not calm exactly, but settled, like he'd made his peace with the situation and was now operating on the other side of that. "How do you feel?" Fitch asked. "Ready." Fitch looked at him. "That's not what I asked." "I know." Adrian adjusted his folder. "I feel like I'm about to walk into a room where a lot of things are going to happen that I can't fully control." "That's accurate." Fitch looked across the street at the Nova Horizon building. "Brooks confirmed she's coming?" "She texted at 7. She's already inside." Something passed across Fitch's face. The brief, restrained version of surprise. She went in early. She said she had things to collect from her office before the meeting. Adrian paused. I think she wanted to be in the building before Sloan arrived. Smart. Fitch picked up his briefcase. Let's go. They crossed the street together. The morning commute was building, people moving in both directions on the sidewalk, the particular ambient noise of a city. Tuesday that paid no attention to what was about to happen in a boardroom on the 16th floor of a glass building. Adrian held the door, and they walked through into the lobby he'd first entered as Daniel Holt, carrying a manila folder and no particular plan beyond watching. The lobby receptionist, a different person than the one who'd processed his visitor badge on the first morning, looked up as they approached. Adrian Holloway, he said, and Robert Fitch, legal counsel. We're here for the board meeting. The receptionist's expression stayed professional, but did something complicated around the edges. She looked at her screen. I'll need to notify. I'm a registered majority shareholder, Adrian said. The notification was filed with the company secretary 11 days ago. I have a legal right to attend and address any board meeting at which a material transaction is under consideration. He put a copy of the filing on the desk in front of her. You're welcome to call whomever you need to call. We'll wait. She called someone. There was a brief, low conversation. She looked at Adrian once during it, then looked back at her screen. When she hung up, she printed 2 visitor badges and slid them across without commentary. 16th floor, she said. I know where it is, Adrian said, and picked up the badges. Bum. The elevator was quiet. Fitch looked straight ahead at the doors. Adrian looked at the floor numbers ascending and thought about the corridor conversation he'd overheard 3 weeks ago. She'll sign off, she doesn't know what she's signing off on, and felt something settle in his chest that wasn't anger and wasn't satisfaction. Just clarity. The particular clarity of a moment you've been moving toward for a long time, finally arriving in front of you. The 16th floor was the executive level. He'd been up here twice during his contractor weeks, both times briefly, and both times had gotten the sense of a floor that was performing a version of authority, glass walls on the conference rooms, the carpet a different quality than the floors below, the overall impression of a space that wanted you to feel the weight of decisions made inside it. The boardroom was at the end of the hall. Its doors were closed. A man was standing outside them. Adrian recognized him as the head of Nova Horizons' in-house legal team, a man named Gerard Voss, who joined the company 18 months ago, who Adrian knew only from the organizational chart Sandra had given him. Voss was mid-50s, compact, and had the expression of a man who'd been told this morning would be complicated and was trying to look like it wasn't. Mr. Holloway, Voss said. He did not extend his hand. The board has been made aware of your filing. There are some procedural questions that Robert Fitch, counsel for Mr. Holloway. Fitch stepped slightly forward, not aggressively, just enough to be clear about the geometry of the conversation. The procedural questions were addressed in the filing and in the supplementary documentation submitted Thursday. Mr. Holloway's attendance and right to address the board on matters related to the Castellan transaction is established under Article 9 of the company charter. If the board has specific procedural objections, they can raise them in the room. Voss looked at Adrian. Mr. Sloan would prefer— I'm sure he would, Adrian said. Open the door. Voss held his gaze for a moment. Then he opened the door. The boardroom was large enough that the people in it hadn't filled it. 8 faces around a table built for 12, turning as the door opened. Adrian registered them in a sweep. 4 independent board members he'd researched and could name, 2 he'd spoken to separately in the past 10 days. Patrick Hollis at the far end looking at the table, a corporate secretary near the window with a notepad, and Victor Sloan standing at the head of the table, and Marcus Kane seated to Sloan's right, and Evelyn Brooks seated 3 chairs down on the left side of the table with a tablet and a folder in front of her and an expression that was difficult to read from the door. Sloan's face, in the moment he registered Adrian, went through a sequence that happened fast but was legible. Recognition, recalibration, the specific kind of controlled anger that manifests as stillness. The board is in session, Sloan said. His voice was even. This is a closed meeting. Article 9, Fitch said, setting his briefcase on the table near the door. Majority shareholder is entitled to attend an address. The majority shareholder filed a petition with procedural irregularities that are under review by Victor. Adrian walked to the table and set his folder down. He didn't take the chair nearest to him. He walked around until he was standing at the midpoint of the table, equidistant from both ends, not at the head. He wasn't doing this as a power gesture. He was doing it so everyone could see him without turning. I'm going to talk now. After I'm done, you can say whatever you want. Sloane's jaw tightened. You don't have the floor. I'm the founder and majority shareholder of this company, and I'm invoking Article 9, Section 4, Paragraph 3 of the founding charter. I have the floor. The room was very quiet. One of the independent directors, a woman named Carla Whitmore, who Adrian had spoken to 4 days ago, carefully, without telling her everything, looked at Sloane and then back at Adrian with the expression of someone who had been told to expect something and was now watching it arrive exactly as described. Adrian opened his folder. I'm going to start with the financial reports, he said. He talked for 32 minutes without stopping. He'd rehearsed it in structure, but not in words, which meant it sounded like a person talking rather than a presentation, which was intentional. He went through the falsified quarterly reports first, the discrepancy between the external filings submitted to the board's audit committee and the internal summary documents that told a different story about the company's operational cash position. He put those documents in front of the board members as he talked, hard copies he'd brought for each person, watching them read while he spoke. Then he moved to the Castellan transaction itself. The preliminary term sheet, the valuation methodology that underpriced Nova Horizons' assets by a margin that benefited Castellan significantly, the timeline structured to close before full due diligence could reasonably be completed. Then the Meridian Advisory Partners Agreement. He heard someone draw a breath when he said the name. Meridian Advisory Partners is a shell company registered in Delaware 14 months ago, he said. The beneficial owner is Victor Sloane. Marcus Kane is listed as a silent partner. He set the registration documents on the table. The company has a consulting agreement with Castellan Group subsidiaries that specifies personal compensation tied to the successful completion of an acquisition of Nova Horizon Energy. The compensation reaches 8 figures at close. He set the consulting agreement beside the registration documents. This arrangement was not disclosed to the board. It was not disclosed to shareholders. It represents a direct financial conflict of interest in a transaction that both Mr. Sloane and Mr. Kane had authority over. He looked at Sloane. Sloane was looking at the document in front of Carla Whitmore. His expression was controlled, but something underneath it had shifted. The particular quality of composure that comes not from calm, but from the decision to perform calm while something else was happening. Kane was looking at his hands. The Charter Clause Amendment, Adrian continued, moving to the next document, was drafted specifically to narrow the operative definition of a material transaction in ways that might insulate this deal from the founding shareholder override provision. I'll let Robert Fitch address the legal analysis, but the short version is that it doesn't work. The amendment cannot override the charter itself, and the charter was explicitly preserved in its original form in the 2019 public registration filing. He set Fitch's annotated analysis on the table. That's page 12, if you want to check. He paused. He looked at the room. Board members were reading. Whitmore had moved to the Meridian Advisory document, and her expression had changed in a way that was telling. Patrick Hollis, at the far end, was very still. There's one more thing, Adrian said. He nodded toward Evelyn. She opened her tablet. She didn't stand up. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady in a way that Adrian thought probably cost her something to maintain. I'm the EVP of Strategic Operations, she said. I was asked to provide internal validation for the Castellan transaction process. I approved a series of documents over the course of approximately 8 months, including the operational framework memo that was presented to the board's executive committee in June. She paused. I approved those documents based on summaries and partial analyses that were provided to me by Mr. Kane's office. Last Saturday, I reviewed documentation that indicates those summaries were curated to omit material information and that my approval was sought specifically because my role would lend credibility to a process I was not given the full picture of. She set the tablet on the table, face up. I've compiled a summary of the discrepancies between what I was provided and the complete documents. It's on the shared board drive, filed in the last hour. She looked at Sloane for the first time since Adrian had started speaking. I was used, she said. I want the board to understand that I understand that. The room was quiet in a way that had texture to it. Sloane said, What's being presented here is a selective and deeply misleading reading of Victor. Carla Whitmore's voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of someone who had decided. Stop talking. Sloane looked at her. Stop talking, she said again. We're going to read these documents. What followed was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. Nobody stood up and confessed. Nobody threw papers across the table. What happened was that 8 people read documents for 40 minutes, while Adrian sat at the side of the room with Fitch, and the air in the room changed by degrees, the way temperature changes. Gradually enough that you couldn't identify the exact moment, but definitively enough that the difference between the beginning and the end was impossible to miss. Hollis asked 2 questions, both directed at Fitch, both legal and technical. Fitch answered them without interpretation, just the factual response. Hollis went back to reading. 2 of the independent directors stepped out together for 10 minutes. When they came back, neither of them looked at Sloane. Kane asked, around the 40-minute mark, whether there was a process for the executives to respond formally to the allegations. His voice had the quality of someone making a request they know won't be granted, but need to make anyway. Whitmore told him that yes, there was a process, and that process would proceed through appropriate channels after the board completed its review of what had been presented. The phrase, appropriate channels, did something to the room's atmosphere. Kane heard it the same way Adrian heard it. Sloane said very little after Whitmore told him to stop talking. He sat at the head of the table with his hands in his lap, and his expression settled into something that Adrian recognized from a long time ago in a different context, as the look of someone who was already doing the math on how far they'd fallen and not liking the numbers. At 9 minutes past 10, Whitmore looked at Adrian. Mr. Holloway, she said, you mentioned the Charter Clause. Article 9, Section 4, you're formally invoking it? Yes, Adrian said. In the event that a material transaction, specifically the proposed acquisition of Nova Horizon Energy by Castellan Group or any affiliated entity, is brought to a vote in any form, I am invoking the founding shareholder override provision requiring my approval. I am withholding that approval. He placed the formal invocation letter on the table. Fitch had drafted it. Adrian had signed it that morning. Additionally, given the evidence of fraud and undisclosed conflicts of interest presented today, I am requesting that the board immediately suspend Mr. Sloane and Mr. Kane from their executive roles pending independent investigation. Whitmore looked at the other independent directors. A brief silent exchange happened between 3 of them, the kind of communication that long familiarity allows, that bypasses language. We'll need a short recess, Whitmore said. Of course, Adrian said. The recess lasted 22 minutes. Adrian stood in the hallway with Fitch. Neither of them spoke much. Fitch looked at his phone once and put it away. Adrian looked at the wall. Down the corridor, Sloane and Kane were standing outside another conference room, talking in low voices with Voss. At one point, Sloane looked up and his eyes met Adrian's across the length of the hallway. Adrian held the look without expression. Sloane looked away first. It wasn't satisfying in the way he might once have expected. The looking away, it didn't fill anything. He'd thought it might, and he was wrong. The boardroom door opened. Whitmore leaned out. We're ready, she said. He walked back in. The vote was 4-1 in favor of immediate suspension of Sloane and Kane pending independent investigation, with Hollis abstaining. The abstention surprised Adrian less than it might have a week ago. Hollis was a man who'd signed something he probably hadn't understood, and abstaining was his way of not compounding it while also not pretending his hands were clean. Adrian wasn't sure what to do with that. He filed it away and left it there. The Castellan transaction was formally suspended pending review. Sloane stood when the vote was announced. He didn't say anything at first. He straightened his jacket with the careful motion of someone marshalling something. Then he looked at Adrian across the table. You've been out of this company for 4 years, Sloane said. His voice was controlled, but the control had a brittleness to it now. You walked away. You made a choice, and you left. And we built something in the time you were gone. You don't get to come back and unmake that. Adrian looked at him. He thought about responding to the substantive part of it, the idea that what had happened in his absence was something built rather than something taken, and decided against it. The investigation will determine what was built, he said. That's what investigations are for. Sloane looked like he had more to say. He didn't say it. He picked up his folder and walked to the door, Kane a step behind him, and they left the boardroom without looking back. Voss lingered for a moment, his face doing something careful and non-committal, and then he left too. The room was quieter without them. Whitmore looked at Adrian. "We'll appoint an interim operating structure by end of week. You'll be consulted, but it'll need to be independent. We can't have the charter challenge questions complicated by the appearance of founder control before the investigation concludes." "I understand." "The investigation firm, I'd like your input but not your selection. Same principle." "Agreed." She studied him. "You've been planning this for a while." "Yes." "You could have come to the board directly, earlier. With what I had 2 months ago, you wouldn't have had enough to act," he said. "And if Sloan had known I was building a case, the documents I needed would have disappeared." Whitmore considered that. "Fair," she said, the way a person says it when they're not entirely satisfied but can't find the argument. He didn't ask her to be satisfied. This wasn't a situation where anybody walked away satisfied. He found Evelyn in the hallway outside the boardroom, alone. She was standing at the window at the end of the corridor, looking out at the city below, and she had the appearance of someone who had just put down something very heavy and was still adjusting to its absence. He stopped a few feet away. "Are you all right?" he asked. She turned. "That's a complicated question." "You can answer it complicated." She looked at him for a moment. "No," she said. "Not really." A pause. "But I think I did the right thing. That's not the same thing as feeling good." "I know." She turned back to the window. "My office is on this floor. I'll need to clear it out eventually, I imagine. The board hasn't made any decisions about personnel beyond the suspensions." "I know what the board said." She said it without bitterness, just the flat pragmatism of someone reading the realistic version of a situation rather than the one they'd prefer. "I spent 8 months making their case for them without knowing it. Even if there's a version where that's forgivable, I'm not the person anyone is going to want as EVP of Strategic Operations going forward." She paused. "I wouldn't want me either, in their position." Adrian didn't argue with her reading. It was probably accurate. "What will you do?" he asked. She considered the question seriously, which he appreciated. He hadn't expected a real answer, but she gave him one. "Something smaller," she said, "for a while. Something where I can see all the documents." It was the kind of thing that sounded like a joke and wasn't, entirely. He almost said something, some form of acknowledgement of what she'd done this morning, the choice she'd made in a coffee shop the night before to call a number she'd had to work to find and tell a stranger she'd been wrong. It seemed like it warranted something, but he didn't know how to say it without it sounding like insufficient return on what it had cost her, so he said only, "I'm grateful for what you did today." She looked at him. "It wasn't for you," she said. "I know that too." For the second time since he'd known her, the first being the elevator, she came close to something that wasn't quite a smile. Then she looked back out the window, and he left her there, standing at the glass with the city spread out below her side. He took the stairs down rather than the elevator, which he couldn't entirely explain except that it felt right, the physical descent, the sound of his footsteps in the stairwell, the building around him doing nothing in particular. He passed the 14th floor where he'd spent weeks moving carefully through corridors trying not to be seen. He passed the 11th floor where Trish Albano had asked him standard questions in a small conference room. He passed the lobby level and kept going one more flight to the building's lower-level exit, which led him out on the side street rather than the plaza. He stood on the sidewalk. The city was fully awake now, mid-morning on a Tuesday, in a place that didn't stop for anything. People moved past him on both sides. A food truck was setting up for the lunch crowd. Someone was arguing into a phone about a delayed shipment, the same argument Adrian had heard 6 weeks ago on the 11th floor, and that apparently was still unresolved. He thought about calling Sandra. She'd want to know. She'd been carrying her piece of this for 8 months, and she deserved to hear it directly from him. He took out his phone. Before he could dial, it rang. Paula Deering. "It's done?" she asked. "The suspension vote passed. The transaction is suspended pending investigation." A pause. "That's what we needed." "Yes." "How do you feel?" It was the same question Fitch had asked this morning, and he gave a different version of the same honest answer. "Like it's not done," he said. "The investigation will take months. The legal process around Sloan and Kane will take longer. There's an interim structure to build and a board that needs to rebuild its own trust. The research programs that were defunded, that's not a switch you flip. He stopped. It's not done. No, Paula agreed, but it's different from this morning. He thought about that. Yes, he said. It is. He hung up and stood on the side street for another minute. Then he called Sandra. She picked up on the second ring. He could hear from the background sound that she was somewhere inside the building. Sandra, he said, it's over. The first part of it anyway. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I knew you'd come back. I almost didn't. I know, but you did. A pause. The building already feels different. I don't know how, but it does. He wasn't sure if that was true or if it was the kind of thing people said when they needed it to be true. He wasn't sure the distinction mattered today. Go home when you can, he said. Get some rest. You too. He put his phone in his pocket. Above him, the glass exterior of the Nova Horizon building caught the mid-morning sun and threw it back in every direction, indifferent to everything that had happened inside it in the past 2 hours. The building didn't know. Buildings didn't know anything. What happened inside them was entirely the work of the people who chose to show up. He walked toward the parking structure with his folder under his arm. There was a long road between today and anything resembling restoration, and he knew it better than anyone. The investigation would surface things he hadn't found. The legal process would be expensive and slow, and there would be days when it felt like nothing was moving. The board would make decisions in the interim period that he disagreed with and couldn't override. The people who'd left, Reyes and the others who'd drifted out in that 6-month window, some of them wouldn't come back regardless of what the company became. I thought about the original team. The 12 people, the bad pizza, the beer someone found on sale. He thought about the speech he'd given that they said was too earnest. He'd meant every word. He still did. That wasn't enough to fix anything, and he knew that. But it was something to build from, which was all you ever really had. He got in his car. He drove. The investigation took 4 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days. Adrian knew the exact count, not because he'd been marking a calendar, but because Sandra had texted him the morning the final report was delivered to the board with a message that said only 4 months, 3 weeks, 2 days. Felt longer. He'd read it at his kitchen table with a coffee that had gone cold and felt the specific weight of a number that represented something you can't get back. Time, certainty. The version of the company that might have existed if none of this had been necessary. He hadn't been in the building during most of it. That had been part of the arrangement with the board's interim oversight structure. Whitmore had been direct about it, in the way she was direct about everything. Your presence in an operational capacity during the investigation complicates the independence question, she'd said. And she was right. And Adrian had agreed without argument because he was tired of arguing about things that were obviously correct. He'd consulted from outside, been interviewed 3 times by the independent investigation firm, a group out of Chicago that specialized in exactly this kind of work, and had the specific manner of people who had seen most things, and were no longer surprised by any of them. He'd handed over everything he had, answered every question fully, and then done the thing that was hardest. He'd waited. Waiting was not something he'd ever been good at. He'd gotten better at it over the 4 years he was gone, or he'd told himself he had, but this kind was different. This was waiting while something that mattered to him was in other people's hands, being examined and assessed and decided on by people he trusted but didn't fully know, and there was nothing he could do to move it faster or steer it differently. He filled the time the way people fill time when they're trying not to think about the one thing they're thinking about. He worked on the operational framework he'd been drafting for the company's eventual transition back, a document nobody had asked him to write, and that he would need to revise substantially once he knew what the investigation found. He called Fitch twice a week. He called Sandra less often because he knew she was being careful inside the building, and he didn't want to put her in a position where the frequency of contact looked like coordination. He went running in the mornings, which he hadn't done consistently in years, and which hurt in ways he'd expected and in a few ways he hadn't, but which gave the days a shape they otherwise lacked. He thought about Evelyn Brooks more than he'd anticipated, not in a way he could fully explain. She'd cleared her office the week after the board meeting, which Sandra had mentioned in passing, and she'd done it apparently without ceremony, came in on a Saturday morning, packed 2 boxes, and left. No farewell email. No announcement. Adrian had heard through a chain of information he wasn't tracing too carefully that she'd taken a consulting engagement with a mid-sized infrastructure nonprofit in another city, something to do with their operational structure. The news carried a kind of logic that he recognized as her. Smaller, she'd said. Something where I can see all the documents. He hoped it was going well. He didn't have a way to ask. What? The investigation report ran 214 pages, and Adrian read all of it over the course of a day and a half, which was not comfortable reading, but was necessary. The findings confirmed what he'd brought into the boardroom and went further. The falsified financial reports had been more systematic than his own evidence had shown. Not just selective omission, but active alteration of figures in two separate quarterly filings, managed through a combination of pressure on the company's internal accounting team and careful compartmentalization that ensured no single person had seen enough of the full picture to understand what they were part of. Two members of the accounting staff had been aware that something was wrong and had said so. Internally, through channels that the report documented, were then quietly ignored. Both of them were still with the company. The report noted this with the dry precision of a document that stated facts and let the reader do the work of feeling them. The Meridian Advisory Partners arrangement was confirmed in its entirety, with additional detail that Paula's documents hadn't captured. A secondary payment tranche tied not just to deal close, but to a specific time frame, the window that would have made it effectively impossible to challenge through legal process before the transaction completed. The design of it was, as Paula had said, sophisticated. The report's language was measured, but if you read it carefully, which Adrian did, the conclusion was that this had been planned with considerable care over a considerable period of time. Patrick Hollis, the independent board member who had abstained from the suspension vote, was found to have received a single payment from a Castellan-adjacent entity that the report categorized as potentially inducing, rather than clearly corrupt, language that said something about what the investigators could prove and something else about what they believed. Hollis had resigned from the board 6 weeks into the investigation, which was the action of someone who understood the math. Sloan and Kane had been formally referred to federal prosecutors. That process would take as long as it took, and Fitch had walked Adrian through the realistic timeline, which was not short and would not be clean. There would be lawyers and motions and delays, and eventually either plea agreements or trials, and the outcome of either would arrive long after Nova Horizon had moved on or failed to, and the story would get coverage, and then less coverage, and then very little. That was how these things went. Adrian had made his peace with the gap between what was right and what was satisfying, or he'd made enough peace with it to function. He sat with the report for a long time after he finished it, not rereading, just sitting. The two accounting staff members who'd raised concerns and been ignored, he kept coming back to that part. They'd done what you were supposed to do. They'd seen something wrong and said so through the appropriate channels, in the appropriate way. And the channels had been managed by people who had every incentive to make sure those concerns went nowhere. I thought about what that must have felt like. To flag something and watch the flag get quietly removed, to decide whether to push harder or let it go, to weigh your job against your conscience and end up in a place where neither felt intact. He was going to do something about that. Not an abstraction, something specific and structural. He didn't have the details worked out yet, but he knew it needed to happen, and he knew why. And he knew it from something that wasn't policy logic. It was personal, in the way that the things you understand not just intellectually, but in your body, are always personal. The board called him back in formally in early December. The meeting was smaller than the one in that boardroom 3 months earlier. Whitmore, 2 other independent directors, and the interim CEO they'd appointed, a woman named Teresa Okafor, who had a background in organizational restructuring and the particular competence of someone who had stepped into broken situations before and was not under any illusions about what the work required. Okafor had called Adrian twice during the investigation period. Not for inside information, she'd been scrupulously appropriate about the boundaries, but for operational history. What the founding culture had actually looked like in practice, not as described in documents, but as lived by the people who built it. What the research programs had been trying to accomplish before they were defunded, who the people were who'd left in that 6-month wave, and what it would realistically take to get any of them back. He'd answered her questions honestly, including the uncomfortable answers, that some of those people wouldn't come back regardless, that the trust required to rebuild a culture like the one Nova Horizon had been founded on was not a thing you restored through memos or leadership statements, but through a long sequence of small decisions that either accumulated into something credible or didn't, and that the process would be slow and some of it would fail. She'd listened without pushback, which he'd found more reassuring than agreement would have been. At the December meeting, the board presented the transition framework. Adrian would return as executive chairman, not CEO, which he hadn't wanted, but a role with genuine authority over strategic direction and the charter provisions that protected the company's mission. Okafor would run operations. The two of them would work alongside each other in a structure that acknowledged both the need for experienced leadership and the need for independence from the founding dynamic that had, in its own way, contributed to the vulnerability the company had been exposed to. Adrian had thought about this part. He'd thought about it more than he'd thought about the investigation, in some ways because the investigation was someone else's work to do, but this was his. "I want two things built into the transition structure," he said, when Whitmore finished presenting the framework. "Non-negotiable." Whitmore looked at him steadily. "Go ahead." "First, an independent internal concerns channel, not HR, not legal. An external ombudsman with direct board access, confidentiality protections, and a documented response requirement. Anyone inside the company who sees something wrong has a place to say, so that isn't managed by the people they're saying it about." Nobody in the room objected. Two people wrote something down. "Second, the research division gets its funding restored. Not to what it was when it was defunded, but to what the original roadmap projected it should be at this point in the company's development. The grid storage program, the distributed generation work, the community resilience project. Those get restored, and they get protected by charter language that requires shareholder approval to defund again." Whitmore looked at the other directors. A brief exchange, the nonverbal kind. "The funding restoration will require board approval on each program," she said, "but the principle is agreed." "The charter protection?" "I'll need Fitch to draft the language, but yes." Adrian sat back. "Then we have a structure." Okafor, who had been quiet through this exchange, looked at him with an expression that was assessing rather than warm. She was still figuring him out, which was reasonable. "You understand," she said, "that the restoration isn't going to feel like restoration for a long time. The people who left, the ones you'd want back, they left for reasons, and some of those reasons were about the company, and some of them were about their lives, and life doesn't pause while you fix a company." "I know that." "And the community programs that were cut, the neighborhoods that were counting on the distributed energy work, the schools that had partnership agreements, some of them found other solutions because they had to. They're not going to drop what they built just because we're back." "I know that too," he said. "We build relationships with what exists now, not with what we wish we hadn't missed." Okafor held his gaze for a moment. She gave a small nod, not agreement exactly, but acknowledgement. The beginning of a working arrangement between two people who weren't sure yet how much they'd trust each other and were being honest about it. That was fine. Trust wasn't a starting point, it was a destination. "I went back to the building on a Thursday morning in January. Not to a meeting, not to an interview, not under a borrowed name. He took the elevator to the 16th floor and walked to the executive suite and sat down at the desk that was now his in the official way that a title in a boardroom vote could make something official. And he looked at the city through the window and felt neither triumphant nor at peace. What he felt was something harder to name. Present, maybe. The sensation of being in the right place for the right reasons, which sounds like it should feel better than it does and doesn't, quite, because the right place contains within it the memory of everything that went wrong before you arrived, and that doesn't go away just because you're where you need to be. Sandra appeared in the doorway 20 minutes after he arrived. She looked at him at the desk, and he looked at her in the doorway, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Strange," he said. "Good strange, I think." She looked around the office, at the desk, the window, the empty shelves where someone else's things had been. "I'll feel better when there's a plant in here," she said. "Right now it looks like a hotel room." He laughed. It was a real laugh, which surprised him slightly. "I'll get a plant," he said. She came in and sat down across from him, which she'd always been comfortable doing and which he was glad about. "What's first?" she asked. He thought about it. "I want to meet with the accounting team," he said. "Both of them. The ones who flagged the irregularities." Sandra's expression shifted. "They've been nervous," she said. about whether the new structure means they're safe or whether it's just new names on the door. That's exactly why I need to talk to them first, he said, before anything else. Before the press release, before the all-staff message, before any of it. She studied him. You've changed some, she said, since before. How? She considered the question seriously, which was another thing he'd always been grateful for about her. She didn't answer casually things that deserved real answers. You're less certain, she said, which sounds like a criticism, but isn't. You used to walk in like you already knew what needed to happen. Now you walk in like you know some of what needs to happen, and you're willing to find out the rest. He wasn't sure she was right, but he wasn't sure she was wrong. Go set up the meeting, he said. She stood. Give me an hour. What? The two accountants were named Jerome Packard and Diana Foss. They came into the conference room together, which made sense. The kind of shared experience they'd been through tended to make people move in formation. Jerome was in his late 30s, quiet-faced, with the careful posture of someone who had spent a long time in an environment where being noticed felt risky. Diana was a few years older, more contained, with the specific quality of stillness that Adrian had come to associate with people who were very good at reading situations and had gotten very tired. He'd asked Sandra to make sure the meeting wasn't presented as anything formal. No agenda sent in advance, no title listed for the meeting in the calendar. Just conversation with the new executive chairman. He didn't want them walking in prepared for an evaluation. He offered them coffee, and nobody took it. I read the investigation report, he said. All of it, including the section about both of you. Jerome looked at his hands. Diana looked at Adrian. You flagged concerns through internal channels, Adrian said. That was the right thing to do. The channels failed you, not the other way around. I want to say that directly. Jerome looked up. Something in his face moved, a small, controlled shift that was the expression of someone hearing something they'd spent a long time not being sure they'd ever hear. We weren't sure, Diana said carefully, how that would be characterized in the aftermath. The report characterized it correctly, Adrian said, and the new internal structure will have a mechanism that makes sure that kind of flagging never disappears into the same hole again. He paused. But I didn't bring you in here to talk about the structure. I brought you in here to ask you something directly. He looked at both of them. What do you need to feel like this is a place worth staying? The question sat in the room for a moment. Diana looked at Jerome. Jerome looked at Diana. The look had history in it, the shorthand of two people who'd been through something together and had talked about it in private more than they'd been able to talk about it anywhere else. Honestly, Diana said, please. We need to see it be different, not be told it's different, see it. She said it without challenge, not aggressive, just true. Because we were told things were fine before. We were told the company had strong governance and leadership that cared about doing things right. We believed it. And then she stopped. So the press release doesn't do it. The all-staff email doesn't do it. What does it is whether 6 months from now, a year from now, when something uncomfortable comes up, the person at the top handles it the right way? That's what we need to see. Adrian nodded. That's a fair answer, he said, and it's not one I can give you in this room. You're right about that. Can I ask you something? Jerome said. It was the first time he'd spoken directly to Adrian. Yes. Why did you come back? Not the official answer, the real one. It was a better question than it might have looked, and Adrian took it seriously. He thought about the parking garage in the early months, the way the information had accumulated and the way he'd told himself he was gathering and was actually hoping to be wrong. He thought about the first morning in the lobby, the logo with the wrong font, the way the grief had hit him before the anger. Because I built this place, he said, not alone. I built it with people, and some of those people aren't here anymore, but I built it with a specific intention, and when I found out what had happened to it, I couldn't. He stopped. I've made a lot of mistakes. Leaving when I was tired was one of them. Not checking was another. I can't go back and make those mistakes not have happened. But I could come back. Jerome looked at him for a moment. Okay, he said. It was a simple word that carried more weight than simple words usually do. They talked for another 40 minutes. Not about policy or structure, but about the work itself. What Jerome's team was actually doing, what Diana's function connected to, what had changed in the past 2 years, and what had stayed the same. Adrian asked questions and listened to the answers without redirecting toward conclusions. It was the kind of conversation he should have been having with people at every level of the company all along, and hadn't been, and the recognition of that sat with him as something he needed to carry rather than resolve. When they left, he sat alone in the conference room for a few minutes. He thought about what Diana had said. We need to see it be different. He'd spent the past 4 months building a case and invoking a clause and sitting through a board meeting and reviewing an investigation report, and all of that had been necessary, and none of it was what she'd been talking about. The documents and the votes and the legal architecture were the preconditions. The actual work was everything that came after. The accumulation of small, unglamorous decisions made correctly over time, in rooms that nobody was watching, under pressures that didn't always feel surmountable. That was the part nobody really wanted to talk about, because it didn't have a clean shape. It didn't resolve in a boardroom. It resolved, if it resolved at all, gradually and partially and imperfectly, and you couldn't point to the moment it happened because there wasn't one. Well, he found Marcus Kane's resignation letter on the shared board drive that afternoon, filed through Voss's office as part of the formal separation process. He didn't read more than the first paragraph. It was the language of legal management, words arranged to create the minimum necessary acknowledgement of departure, and it didn't say anything real about anything. He closed the file. Sloane's situation was still working through the legal process. It would continue working through the legal process for a long time. Adrian had accepted that the narrative would be complicated. There would be Sloane's attorneys framing what had happened in terms that were designed to create doubt. And there would be coverage that flattened the complexity into something simpler than it was in either direction. And there would be people who followed the story and people who didn't. And the outcome would be whatever it turned out to be, and he had no control over most of it. What he had control over was narrower and more important. He had control over whether the ombudsman structure actually got built with the independence it needed or got slowly absorbed into the organizational gravity that always wanted to make inconvenient things less inconvenient. He had control over whether the charter protections for the research division were written tightly enough to mean something or loosely enough to be maneuvered around. He had control over whether the conversations he had with people like Jerome and Diana were one-time gestures or the beginning of a different kind of relationship between the people who ran this place and the people who worked in it. He was under no illusion that control over these things meant they would go the way he intended. He'd believed in the governance structure before, and the governance structure had been worked around by people who were motivated and patient. Good intentions, he'd learned, or relearned in the expensive way, were not sufficient architecture. They were motivation. The architecture was the hard part. Sandra came back to his office in the late afternoon with a plant. It was a small one, something green in a terracotta pot that he couldn't identify by species, sitting in a plastic bag from the shop on the corner. "You said you'd get one," she said, setting it on the windowsill. "I didn't trust you to actually do it." "I said I'd get one today?" "You implied it." The energy was very, "I'll get to that." He looked at the plant on the windowsill against the city light. It looked improbable and slightly inadequate and right. "Thank you, Sandra," he said. She waved it off. "The all-staff message goes out tomorrow morning. Okafor drafted it. I'll send you the final version tonight." She moved toward the door, then stopped. The research team, the grid storage people, the ones who stuck around after the defunding, they've been in a kind of limbo, working on small maintenance tasks, waiting. "I think you should go down to that floor tomorrow, not for a meeting, just walk through." "I will." "Don't announce it, just show up." She looked at him. They'd been waiting a long time to know if anyone upstairs was paying attention. He thought about Reyes, the research division lead Sandra had mentioned months ago, who'd left in that 6-month wave with 5 others, quietly, without announcements. He'd tried to reach Reyes twice. The first time, no response. The second time, a polite but brief reply that said he was settled in a new position and wished the company well, which said everything and nothing simultaneously. Some of the people who'd left wouldn't come back. He'd known that intellectually, and now he knew it in the specific named way of an actual person who'd made a decision he understood and couldn't undo. That was going to stay uncomfortable for a long time, and trying to resolve the discomfort was the wrong response. The right response was to make the company worth returning to for the people who might still consider it, and worth being in for the people who'd stayed through the worst of it. After Sandra left, he turned his chair to face the window. The city spread out below him, indifferent in the way that cities are, continuing its business in all directions. He thought about the 12 people, and the pizza, and the beer, and the speech that was too earnest, and he thought about the distance between that room and this one, not just in time, but in everything that had happened inside the time. The choices he'd made and the choices made without him, and the choices that were still ahead. He'd told Sandra he'd come back because he couldn't not. That was true, but it was incomplete, the way the simplest version of a true thing is always incomplete. The fuller version was something he'd been working his way toward for months, and it had to do with what you owed the thing you built. Not ownership in the legal sense, not credit or legacy or recognition, but something more basic than all of those. Accountability. The recognition that building something and then leaving it created a responsibility that didn't expire when you walked away, and that when the thing you built was damaged by the people you left it with, walking away again was a choice that cost more than it appeared to. He wasn't the hero of this story. That was the part he wanted to be clear about, with himself more than anyone. He'd made the mistakes that made the problem possible. He'd come back and done what needed to be done, which was right. But doing what needed to be done after failing to prevent it from being necessary was not the story he wanted to tell himself when he was making it simple. The fuller version included the 4 years and the not checking and the way the exhaustion had looked like wisdom when it had actually been avoidance. You had to carry both. The coming back and the leaving. The fixing and the creating conditions for the break. The people who'd stayed and the people who'd gone. The investigation report with its 214 pages and the 2 accounting staff members who'd done the right thing in a system designed to make the right thing go nowhere. The plant sat on the windowsill, catching the last of the afternoon light. He turned back to his desk. There was a message from Okafor about the research division funding timeline. There was a draft from Fitch on the charter language for the ombudsman structure. There was a note from Jerome Packard, sent an hour after their meeting, that said only, "Thank you for the conversation. It was different from what I expected. That's a start. That's a start." He read it twice. Then he opened Fitch's draft and began to read. The work was not glamorous. It was documents and language and arguments about words, and it was conversations in conference rooms, and it was walking through floors and saying nothing particularly memorable, and it was decisions made in the absence of certainty and revised when the certainty arrived. It was slow, and it was cumulative, and most of what it produced would never be visible from the outside. He'd built something once, he'd lost track of it, he'd come back. What he built now would be different, smaller in some ways, more careful in others, built with the knowledge of what gets broken when you stop paying attention instead of the optimism of someone who hasn't found out yet. That wasn't a worse way to build, just an older one. Outside, the city kept going. The grid that Nova Horizons research teams had been working to improve. The communities the distributed energy programs were meant to serve. The schools and the neighborhoods that had kept moving when the company pulled back. They were all out there in the ordinary Tuesday complexity of the world, needing what good work could provide and not waiting on any particular story to resolve itself. He had work to do. He did it. The message from Jerome sat in the corner of his screen while he worked through Fitch's draft, and he kept returning to it the way you return to something small that holds more weight than its size suggests. That's a start. 4 words from a man who'd spent months inside a building where the right thing had been quietly erased, who'd done what he was supposed to do and watched it disappear, and who was now deciding carefully whether to believe that the ground had actually changed beneath him. Adrian understood the carefulness. He respected it more than he would have respected easy reassurance. He finished the Fitch draft at 6:30, made notes in the margins, and sent it back with 3 specific questions about the language in the Ombudsman clause that he wasn't satisfied with. The clause needed teeth, not the appearance of teeth, but the actual structural mechanism that made the protection real rather than performative. He'd seen enough performative protection in the investigation report to know exactly what he was trying to avoid, and the line between the two was thinner than most people building these things wanted to admit. He thought about that line a lot in the weeks that followed. The all-staff message went out Thursday morning. Okafor had written it, and it was good, direct without being cold, honest about what had happened without dwelling in it, forward-looking without the false brightness of a company trying to pretend the past several months hadn't occurred. Adrian had read the final version the night before and made one small suggestion, which Okafor had incorporated without comment, and the version that went out was better than the one he would have written himself. He recognized this clearly and without discomfort, which was itself something new. The responses came in through the day. Not to him, he wasn't listed in the message as a contact, but Sandra forwarded him a sampling, not the positive ones, but the mixed ones, the ones from people who were cautious or skeptical or who asked questions that didn't have clean answers yet. He read all of them. One in particular stayed with him. It was from someone in the facilities team, not senior, not someone whose name appeared in any of the organizational documents he'd reviewed. And it said, "I've been here 7 years. I've heard a lot of announcements. I'll believe it when the bathroom on the 3rd floor finally gets fixed." He laughed when he read it, and then he sent a note to Okafor's office asking who handled facilities requests and whether there was a backlog. There was a backlog. There was always a backlog. He asked for the list. He went down to the research division on a Friday morning, unannounced, the way Sandra had suggested. The floor had a different quality than the executive levels, less managed somehow, the way spaces feel when they're organized around work rather than the appearance of work. There were whiteboards with diagrams that had been partially erased and written over, desks that had the productive chaos of people who were actually using them, a general ambient noise of people in the middle of things. He walked through slowly. He didn't gather anyone, didn't call attention to himself. He stopped to look at a whiteboard near the window that had a system diagram on it. The grid storage project. He recognized the structure of it from the original proposal documents he'd read years ago, though the specifics had evolved considerably. A man in his early 40s noticed him looking and came over. His name badge said R. Chen. "Executive Chairman," Chen said, with the particular tone of someone identifying a species rather than greeting one. "I'm not here for anything official," Adrian said. "I just wanted to see what's happening down here." Chen looked at him for a moment. "The project got defunded 8 months ago. We've been maintaining what we built and doing literature review and trying not to lose the institutional knowledge while we waited to find out if we still had jobs. The funding is being restored. The board approved the principal 2 weeks ago, and the specific allocations are being finalized now." "I heard that." Chen looked at the whiteboard. "I'll believe the specific allocations when I see the specific allocations." It was nearly the same sentence as the facilities email. Adrian wondered if there was something in the building's water that produced this particular brand of earned skepticism and decided it wasn't the water. "That's reasonable," he said. "In the meantime, what does the team need right now this week to not lose ground?" Chen blinked. It was a small reaction but legible, the expression of someone who had prepared for several versions of this conversation and not this one. "Access to the simulation software license that got canceled," he said. "We've been working around it for 3 months. It's slowing everything down." "Send me the details. I'll have it resolved by end of next week." Chen looked at him the way Jerome had looked at him in the conference room, evaluating, not convinced, but registering the data point. "Okay," he said. Adrian nodded and kept walking. He stayed on the floor for another 40 minutes, moving through the space, asking questions when people were willing to answer them, listening more than he talked. He learned things that weren't in any document he'd reviewed. The informal structure of the team, the relationships that had formed during the difficult months, the 2 junior researchers who had apparently kept the distributed generation project alive, essentially through personal determination while officially working on maintenance tasks. He made mental notes and wrote none of them down, because writing things down in front of people who are still deciding whether to trust you has a specific effect that isn't useful. When he left the floor, he took the stairs again. He'd developed the habit during the weeks he'd been a contractor, moving through the building in ways that the elevator didn't allow, and he'd kept it. The stairwell was the same on every floor, same concrete, same light, same sound of his footsteps, and there was something about the unchanging quality of it that he found grounding in a way he couldn't fully rationalize. The simulation software license was restored in 5 days, not 7. Chen sent a 2-line email confirming it had been activated. No thank you, no elaboration. Adrian read it and thought, good. That was how trust got built, not through gestures, but through the boring, repeated reliability of someone doing what they said they'd do in the time frame. They said they'd do it, and then doing it again and again until the pattern was undeniable. He was under no illusion that 5 days on a software license was sufficient evidence of anything. But it was a data point, and data points accumulated, and what they accumulated into was either credibility or its absence. He intended to accumulate. It was Fitch who brought up the question of legacy, in the way that Fitch brought up everything, indirectly, framed as a practical consideration, but carrying something more personal underneath. They were on the phone on a Tuesday evening, working through the final language on the charter amendment, and Fitch said, "You know the amendments will outlast you." That's the intention. I mean specifically, the ombudsman structure, the research division protections. If someone capable and motivated wanted to work around them 20 years from now, they'd find ways. The language closes the obvious gaps. It doesn't close every possible gap. Nothing does, Adrian said. No. Fitch paused. What I'm getting at is, what you're building right now is more durable than what was here before, but it's not permanent, and I think you know that. I know that. So what's the theory? Fitch asked. Not legally, practically. What makes this hold? Adrian thought about it for a long time. Long enough that Fitch, who was used to the pause and didn't fill it, waited him out. The people, Adrian said finally, not the documents. The documents matter. They constrain behavior and create accountability, and that's real. But what makes a place hold to what it's supposed to be, long-term, is whether the people inside it understand why it exists and believe the why is worth protecting. He paused. Jerome Packard flagged irregularities in a system that was designed to make his flag go nowhere. He did it anyway. That's not because of charter language. That's because of something he believed about what was right. He stopped. The job is to build a place that people like Jerome want to stay in. If you do that well enough, for long enough, you get an institution that defends itself. Not perfectly, but better than documents alone. Fitch was quiet for a moment. That's going to take a long time. Yes. You might not be around to see it finish. I know. Does that bother you? Adrian looked out the window of the apartment he was still living in, the one he'd rented for a month that had turned into most of a year. He was going to need to find a more permanent arrangement. He'd been putting it off in the way that you put off decisions that feel like they require you to commit to a future you haven't fully decided on yet. No, he said, and found that it was true. If I build something that holds because the people in it want it to hold, the fact that I'm not there to see it is the point, not the problem. Fitch made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite agreement. All right, he said, let me send you the revised amendment language. Months later. Not long enough to be a resolution, but long enough to be a different chapter. Adrian stood in the lobby of the Nova Horizon building on a Thursday morning in early spring and looked at the logo on the wall behind the reception desk. They hadn't changed the font back. He'd noticed this a few weeks after returning and had decided to leave it. The original font was gone, and trying to restore it felt like the wrong kind of nostalgia, the kind that mistook the symbol for the thing itself. What mattered wasn't the font. What mattered was what happened inside the building that bore the name. The lobby was fuller than it had been on the morning he'd first walked in as Daniel Holt. Not dramatically so, the company was the same size, more or less. But the quality of the fullness was different. People moved through it with the slightly different energy of a place that had been through something and was still here. Not triumphant. Not healed, exactly. Something more honest than either. The specific forward motion of people who knew the ground had been unstable and were walking on it anyway because the work was still there to be done. The receptionist, a young man he'd learned was named Terrence, who had started 3 months ago and had no direct experience of the worst of it, and was therefore building his understanding of Nova Horizon from what it was now, looked up and nodded in recognition. "Morning, Mr. Holloway." "Morning, Terrence." He walked to the elevator. He pushed the button for the 16th floor, then changed his mind and pushed 12 instead. The research division had been moved up during the reorganization, given more space, which had required a floor reshuffle that had caused 3 weeks of logistical complaints that Sandra had managed with the particular patience of someone who understood that logistical complaints were a healthy sign in an organization. The elevator opened on 12. He walked through the floor. R. Chen was at his desk, in front of the simulation software that was now running, talking on the phone about a modeling question that Adrian didn't follow technically, but whose energy, the energy of someone engaged with a real problem, was unmistakable. Chen glanced over, registered Adrian's presence, and looked back at his screen without interrupting his call. Adrian kept walking. That was the whole of it, really. Not the boardroom, not the documents, not the clause he'd written 15 years ago and finally needed to use. The whole of it was a man at a desk, doing work he cared about, in a place that hadn't been destroyed because someone had come back when they should have and done what needed to be done. He didn't stop to note it or mark it or say anything about it to anyone. He just walked through the floor and took the stairs up to 16 and sat down at his desk and opened the message from Okafor about the next phase of the community program restoration and began to read. The work continued, as it was supposed to, as it would.